Well, good afternoon to all our listeners, our viewers, Facebook, on YouTube, wherever you are, and you are here tuned in to the launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series hosted by the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. For us, it's a very exciting and important moment because we begin this period of the emancipation where we focus on our ideas, where we focus on sharing information. And then when we get down to the end of the month, as you all know, then we're celebrating big time. But now we are focusing on the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And this evening, of course, we have as our very special guest to launch the program, Dr. Peniel Joseph. And he's going to be speaking about the modern Pan-African struggle and the ongoing fight for racial justice, the legacy of Kwame Ture. But before I get around to bringing that wonderful brother to you, and I know you're excited to see and hear him, let me just tell you a little bit about the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series for a moment. Listen, this series has been running for about 25 years. 25 years, that's a good institution. We began simply as the public lecture series of the Emancipation Support Committee, and that began in 1998. And actually, it was our good brother Kwame Ture who spoke then. Actually, he spoke in 1999. In 1998, it was our wonderful sister Winnie Mandela. And we also opened our office in 1998. When our brother came in, we brought him home in I got my years all wrong. 1996, Kwame was home. And in 1996, he spoke at our Emancipation Public Lecture Series. He was followed by Winnie Mandela. When he made his transition in 1998, we made the decision to change the name of the Emancipation Public Lecture Series to the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And our first guest speaker then was none other than Dr. Kathleen Cleaver, whom I had met at Kwame's deathbed in New York. And she was with Kwame in the Panther Party, in the Black Panther Party. And it was wonderful to have her speak not only about him, but about the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement, and how Kwame lived. Later on, we really had some amazing people here with us, and I'm just going to name a few so you get a sense of the breadth of the lecture series. We've had people like Dr. Asa Hilliard. He's an educational psychologist. Professor Ali Mazuri out of Tanzania. Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Dr. Yusuf Benyakanan. Dr. Lisa Aubrey. Our own Professor Hilary Breckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Wade Nobles. So it has been a wonderful period, a wonderful 25 years, ensuring that the people of Trinidad and Tobago and our brothers and sisters across the region and the diaspora could share in the knowledge that all these wonderful, hardworking researchers and activists brought to the table for us. And this year, it is going to be no different. We have quite an amazing program for you, and I'm just going to list a little bit, and I think our sister will give me a schedule there. Yes, so this is the 22nd of June, and we are launching the program, as I said, with Dr. Peniel Joseph. We then move to the 29th. We are every Thursday at 5 p.m., same place, same time, you can find us. On the 29th, we're looking at Africa on the international stage, her challenges and successes. We'll hear from Professor James Small, Mr. Joseph Aketema from the University of Ghana, and a representative from the African Union Commission. Then we move to the 6th of July, and we're going to be talking about Haiti on the 6th of July and a Pan-African responsibility. What's our responsibility for Haiti and towards Haiti? We will have Professor Muriel Fanon Mendez France as our lead presenter, and our own Roel Gibbons from the University of the West Indies, founder, of the Creative Arts Center of UWI, and now sort of coordinator and director of the Caribbean Yard campus. And Raul will talk to us about the use of theater and art in sharing the knowledge about Haiti. On the 13th, we move to Youth in Crisis, the responsibility of educators and elders. And there we will be led by Dr. Pedro Noguera, a really renowned sociologist, a wonderful brother who treats with understanding how we can ensure that our young men are engaged and active and safeguarded from the kind of travails of this environment that we live in. Our own young Khadija Daya from the Emancipation Support Committee will also be there, and Shabaka Kambon will moderate that session. Then we close off looking at women in the Pan-African struggle. We'll have our wonderful sister, Dr. Carol Boyce Davies, with us. And Carol will probably talk to us a little bit about her last book on Claudia Jones. Together with Dr. Carol will be our own sister, Dr. Olabisi Kumoni, who will look at the women in the 1970 revolution here in Trinidad and Tobago. And then young Dr. Keisha Thompson, a recent doctoral achiever of her doctoral status, who will be looking at some work she had done in the process of getting her doctoral thesis on women in the struggle, particularly Trinidad and Tobago. So I think we're going to have a very interesting and full Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series this year. And I look forward to all of you joining us, both, as I said, on Facebook and on YouTube. Hopefully next year, we'll be able to bring this Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series back to that status where we had our guest speakers in-house speaking to you and with you. And but we'll always keep the hybrid. We'll always keep the hybrid going because we know that we have quite a large number of listeners from the continent, from North America, up the Caribbean islands. So we look forward to being able to keep them as well. So from next year, we will be looking forward to a hybrid program. But this year we are online. Now, before I bring this exciting brother to you, and I know everyone's biting at the bits, but let me invite this wonderful sister, Dr. Intu Pearl Springer, who has a long history of activism in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean, and even, might I say, across the globe, because Intu was one of those early members of the Black Panthers in London. And we're talking about 1960s, huh? She was also a member of NJAC, the National Joint Action Committee, and that was the lead organization that led the Black Power movement and the Black Power Revolution of 1970. She's a founding member of the Emancipation Support Committee and was its first director of culture. Sister Intu is also Poet Laureate of the City of Port of Spain, a recipient of a Vanguard Award for her contribution to theater, because we all know her as a playwright and poet. So she's poet, playwright, actress, and activist for African spirituality. She has a National Award for Culture and an honorary doctorate from our National University of Trinidad and Tobago. She, by the way, is one of the holders of the very prestigious Henry Sylvester Williams Award of Excellence, given out gingerly by the Emancipation Support Committee. I'm going to welcome now our sister, Dr. Intu Pearl Springer. She's going to do for us a poem called I Have Had No Youth. Dr. Springer, to you.
I have had no youth. I gave it up to causes, to commitment. The embryo force-ripened, catalyzed by recognition of poverty, discrimination, moved in desperation to shift the balance of power. My father backbent, life spent beneath the citrus and cocoa of Stallmeyer, swallowing his pride, was forced to abide every indignity to feed his family. He found an early death. His lungs collapsed from the consumptive fluid. His father mourned him. His children, hardly knowing him, watched stonily as Mother Earth received him thankfully from his short, brutish existence. The hymns intoned in the cemetery, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Rock of ages cleft for me. Be thou my guardian and my guide. They were oddly at variance in their cadence from the white, immobile statues in the nearby church. In the twilight, we have mourned him. The mother sang, hardly sparing the time to grieve, focused solely on her children's needs. In time, we smashed those statues, well, painted them black, black like we, in vengeance writ on a God with seeming bias against our color, maybe because he came from the same power, from the same color as our oppressors. Black power, urging we, like Bookman, to give allegiance to a God of one cheek that does not turn, that does not turn. And Simone told us we were young, gifted, and black, and we went eagerly back to Butler and Garvey. Hungrily, we drank the words of Malcolm X, and Cleaver, of Cambon, and Macandal Dagger. How proud we were of Kwame Ture, child of the very hills from which we were carrying the flag still. And we knew no fear. Even when the Mahasabha tried to stop us linking with our Indian brother, we marched into Karani and the people welcomed us gladly. And we knew no fear. We marched everywhere, raising Ogun's red, marching evil to bury our dead. Yes, they came for us. They're disillusioned young in the marching time, in the revolution time, in the curfew time. We fought their guns with sticks and stones, but we made some of our own in the marching time. In the revolution time, when fists mocked the skies and we cried enough of scrambling for pennies in the dust, they came for us, meaning to kill us. The sirens screamed, our young blood was spilled across the land, but in our righteous cause, we knew no fear. In the curfew time, the overburdened cells groaned beneath our weight, but we knew no fear. Even when Hudson Phillips passed laws lifted straight from apartheid South Africa with Asha and Olabisi, we tried to build institutions for the African family. And the poets and musicians, craftsmen, dancers, actors and calypsonians worked to build a better nation that would give respect to the African. Building Black traditions, making links across the islands and the African diaspora, teaching the truth of Africa and pride in our roots that go deep within us. Years of working, years of teaching, walking, talking in those hills of love until I've had no youth. No dreams are dust. Betrayed by leaders undeserving of our trust, we sacrifice our bright future to macho egomania and paranoia. Youth pass quickly from idealistic ferment into disillusionment. Now the black mass swarms leaderless. Now Ogun's war chant goes unanswered in large measure. Now I carry the weariness of one who has no youth, no youth.
How can we thank our sister very deeply for sharing that poem with us this afternoon? Um, what can I say? It comes out of a period when indeed she speaks of all the struggles, all the marches, all the time spent um, working to educate our people so that they can understand what the struggle for racial justice was all about and what the struggle for Black power was about. And so we thank you deeply, Into. And I'm hoping that all the young people who are listening in this evening will ensure that they have copies of that book that Auntie Into was sitting and had on her lap. Um, that particular one that has that poem in it, I think is, if I remember correctly, is called um, Loving the Skin I'm In. That's the title of the book of her poems that from which she read, I Have Had No Youth. So we thank you very much, Into. And now I'm going to introduce you just to a very beautiful group of young people. They're called the Soul Oasis Cultural Ambassadors, and we're going to enjoy some of their contribution of art to this very interesting evening. Well, that was the exciting young people from the Soul Oasis Cultural Ambassadors. And that was a taste of what occurred at the last week's Yoruba Drum Festival. The Yoruba Drum Festival is part of the Pan-African Festival in commemoration of emancipation. And our speaker, Dr. Peniel Joseph, he's familiar with that notion of emancipation, very familiar, because just the other day, June 19th, to be exact, in North America, everyone was busy celebrating and marking the emancipation of African persons from enslavement in North America. And that unknown 2 years when people was lagging, when people were still enslaved, when they should have been able to express their freedom. So we mark our emancipation. We begin the process on the 25th of May, which is African Day now called, but African Liberation Day for us. And we continue until August 1st, which marks the day in which African people put an end to chattel slavery in the English-speaking Caribbean. So we thank those young people, and now it's my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. He is none other than Dr. Peniel E. Joseph. He is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values. He's the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He's the Public Policy and International Affairs Program Board Chair and Distinguished Service Professor and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. He's an internationally recognized scholar and activist, an author and editor of 7 award-winning books, most recently, The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century, winner of the 2023 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. Additionally, in 2022, he was named the grand prize winner of the 2022 Hamilton Book Award at the University of Texas at Austin's highest research honor for his book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He's a frequent national commentator on issues of race, civil rights, and democracy, a fellow of the Society of American Historians, and a contributing writer for CNN, and he lives in Austin, Texas. I'll tell you one other little thing about him. He's the son of Haitian immigrants. And we from Trinidad and Tobago, of course, we hold Haiti very, very dearly in our hearts, not only because many of our ancestral parents or grandparents came from Haiti during that cedula of population when the Spanish were trying to bring more slave masters into the island, into Trinidad and Tobago, and they were allowed to bring with them their enslaved persons. And that's how many people in Trinidad and Tobago have last names that are the same as their brothers and sisters in Haiti, and we have a long history of Creole speaking as well. So I'm very excited to bring this young man to you. I'm just going to show you his 2 books. This is Stokely A Life, wonderful reading, and the one I mentioned, The Sword and the Shield. You know, get your sisters and brothers and friends and colleagues who are abroad to buy them for you and send them down. You want to have it, let them know you've got to read it. I give you now this wonderful young man, Dr. Peniel Joseph. The floor is yours, brother.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cambone. Thank you, everyone who's part of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. It's really my honor. As Dr. Cambone was saying, I am the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. I was born and raised in New York City. I want to, dedicate this talk to my late mother, Jermaine Lacroix Joseph, who recently passed at 83 years of age, but was my first teacher and organizer. I was on my first picket line in the 1970s in New York City, outside of Mount Sinai Hospital, SCIU 1199. And I learned so much about Haitian history and Pan-Caribbean and Pan-African history and solidarity growing up in New York City during the 1980s, the age of anti-apartheid, but also an age of police brutality, and being connected to so many forces that were Black radical freedom forces. And when we think about Kwame Ture, who I'll be discussing this afternoon, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, I first encountered the story and the narrative of Kwame Ture when I was very, very young in elementary and junior high school, both through my mother's books, but also through the Eyes on the Prize television series that was on PBS. And then there was Eyes on the Prize 2 by the time I was in high school. And those series sort of documented aspects of Kwame Ture's activism, his civil rights activism, his Black Power activism, and some of his Pan-African activism. And that got me very, very intrigued. And along the way, when I was in graduate school, I went to Temple University in Philadelphia. During my first or second year of graduate school, Kwame Ture actually spoke at the University of Pennsylvania, which was just in West Philly, and I lived in North Philly and went down to hear him speak. There must have been close to 1,000 people there, and Kwame Ture gave this really extraordinary speech. This is the mid-90s. Bill Clinton was president, gave an extraordinary speech about revolutionary Pan-Africanism, a critique of capitalism, a critique of materialism and racism, and then strategies for Black political self-determination. And after his speech, I had a chance to meet Kwame Ture. I had a chance to shake Kwame Ture's hand. And it was an experience of a lifetime. He looked like an African prince, and he had on his robes, and he had gray hair, and he was very, very lovely and humble. But he also asked me what I was doing on behalf of the liberation of our people. So you flash forward from that meeting in around 1994. This is a little before he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I started to do research on Kwame Ture to write a biography of Kwame Ture. I'd been working on books about the Black Power movement, and I found that Kwame Ture linked so many different aspects of the Black liberation struggle globally. He was somebody who was mentored by Malcolm X. He was mentored by Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. He was mentored by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, and he also mentored so many different activists who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were part of the Nonviolent Action Group, NAG, in Washington, D.C., at Howard University. He was mentored by Gloria Richardson, the Cambridge, Maryland activist and one of the most important figures of the 1960s. And so in so many ways, Kwame Ture becomes somebody who links so many different strands of the Black freedom struggle together, both in Trinidad, but also throughout the Caribbean, in parts of Europe and the United States, of course, and Canada, but also throughout Africa and the third world. And what I want to talk about today is really Kwame Ture's continuing legacy in this idea of Pan-Africanism, because I argue that Kwame Ture really was always a Pan-Africanist, even when he was in high school, even when he is new to the United States. He comes to the United States from Port of Spain, Trinidad, on June 15th, 1952, 2 weeks before his 11th birthday. And his growing up, 54 Oxford Street in Trinidad is very, very important, because Trinidad, and he writes this in his own autobiography that is done with Kwame Michael Thelwell, Ready for Revolution, that growing up in Port of Spain is really, really key to his Pan-African development, because Kwame Ture grew up surrounded by Black people. And he grew up surrounded by Black excellence. He was himself a brilliant student, a brilliant reader and writer and critic and analyst. But he never took that for granted. He always understood that that idea of Black political self-determination was key. And so by the time he was transplanted to the United States, to New York City, to the Bronx, and the Morris Park section of the Bronx, he was always thinking about the connections between Black folks in America with Black folks in the Caribbean and Black folks in Africa. So as early as his high school years, he's listening to African and world music. He listens to Miriam Makeba, who is his future wife, and he tells his sister he's going to marry Miriam Makeba. In so many different ways, what we're going to see as Stokely Carmichael evolves into Kwame Ture is really this very impressive interest in Africa, and this interest in African liberation and how it connects to Black liberation in the United States, in the Deep South, but also in urban centers, in the Caribbean, really the world over. So in that sense, Kwame Ture is really somebody who, alongside of somebody like Malcolm X, who also goes to Africa, who also really, we think about Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, this idea of we are an African people. And Kwame Ture taught Black Americans, alongside of people like Malcolm X and Queen Mother Moore and Marcus Garvey, that we were an African people, right, wherever we were from. So when we think about Kwame Ture's political activism during the 1950s, this is even before his college years and his years in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. He is a Pan-Africanist. I mean, he is organizing alongside Black folks, even in New York City and Harlem and the Bronx, for political self-determination. But the 1960s provide him with, and Howard University is really a proving ground and an incubator for a more sophisticated and mature understanding of the Black freedom struggle and Pan-Africanism. And the reason why Howard University is so important is that Kwame Ture had the chance to go to Harvard on scholarship, but instead chose to go to Howard. And he was at Howard University from 1960 to 1964. And I would argue that, there's probably no better proving ground for Pan-Africanism and revolutionary Pan-Africanism than Howard University in the 1950s and 60s. So Kwame Ture encounters so many brilliant Black American, Black Caribbean, Black African sisters and brothers at Howard University, everybody from Toni Morrison to so many different professors and poets and artists and activists, but also political leaders, people who were going to play big roles in the decolonization of Africa and the Caribbean, and folks who were going to play a big role in efforts at anti-racist efforts in the United States. So Howard University is very, very important. But so is Kwame Ture's travels to the Deep South. He's going to first go to Mississippi in 1961 as a freedom rider. And Kwame Ture is going to spend his 20th birthday in prison in Jackson, Mississippi, and then at Parchman Penitentiary in the Mississippi Delta. And these are going to have really, really big consequences for him. In his autobiography, he recounts the similarities that he sees between Black folks in the Delta in Mississippi and in rural Alabama, Black folks in Trinidad, and then Black folks in Conakry, Guinea, where he's going to spend really the bulk of his life. And so in a lot of ways, what the political activism and experience that Kwame Ture undergoes in the Deep South in the early 60s really provides them with a context for the revolutionary Pan-Africanism that he's going to articulate as he comes to political maturity. three themes that really can connect us with Kwame Ture are these themes of personal sincerity, political integrity, and an unapologetic love for Black people and Black history and Black culture, but for African people, African history and African culture, Caribbean people, Caribbean history, and Caribbean culture. So in a lot of ways, when we think about Kwame Ture's Pan-Africanism, it goes beyond just the idea of self-determination for Africa and self-determination for Black people the world over. He was really interested in the granular stories and experiences of Black people, which is one of the reasons why he becomes such an important political activist and organizer. Even in the years before the Black Power fame and celebrity and iconography, people thought of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, as this acute listener and this master teacher who was able to sit and listen to Black folks in the Mississippi Delta, Black folks in Lowndes County, Alabama, Black folks in Tennessee. He was able to testify at the US Civil Rights Commission in 1963. He was able to organize sit-ins outside of Bobby Kennedy's office as U.S. Attorney General in 1962. He became a student leader at Howard University who had this kind of effortless charisma, who had a wonderful sense of humor, but also had deep, deep empathy and compassion for the poorest Black people who were living both in the Deep South and throughout the United States during that era. So in many ways, when we think about Kwame Ture and his revolutionary Pan-Africanism, it's something that's incubated even before he's mentored by Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, before the founding of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, before Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party. Before all of that, it's important for us to understand. And really, Kwame Ture is really a civil rights activist who becomes a Black Power radical, who becomes a Pan-African revolutionary. And not many people had the precise experiences and trajectory that Kwame Ture is able to have. And when we think about that, that's really important because he's somebody who helps organize for Malcolm X's 1961 debate appearance with Bayard Rustin at Howard University. I've got a great picture in my archives of Kwame Ture in the front row of the audience in October of 1961 as Malcolm X is debating Bayard Rustin. And it's so interesting because just in a few years, Kwame Ture is going to be the person who so many people come to see and hear debate what does Black Power mean. And in many ways, Kwame Ture defined Black Power as radical political, social, cultural, economic self-determination. He's going to eventually define Black Power as revolutionary Pan-Africanism under a very specific vision of African socialism. He's going to define Black Power as something that not only resists white supremacy globally, but also allows Black people to flourish wherever they are. And the key to that is Black people understanding their story, and the root of that story is always Africa. And that's this whole idea of we are an African people. When we think about Kwame Ture and Black Power, I think it's important to remember that the Black Power speech on June 16th, 1966, at the Meredith March Against Fear, is really the culmination of a decade of political activism. Kwame Ture had been active as a high school student at Bronx Science. He had been active at Howard University as an organizer. He meets with people like James Baldwin and Martin Luther King Jr., but he also is active in Mississippi. He is the congressional district director for Mississippi Freedom Summer, the second congressional district director. So people like Bob Moses, who's the very famous SNCC organizer, really trusts Kwame Ture as somebody who's this unbelievable organizer who's able to go in some of the most dangerous parts of the South and risk his life. He's arrested really throughout his lifetime over 40 times for civil rights activism, both in the United States, but also in Africa. And so when we think about his notion of Black power, his notion of Black power is something that's based on real experience. I mean, Kwame Ture is both formally educated at Bronx Science and Howard University, but he's also an autodidact. He's also somebody who's self-taught and somebody who really is a keen and attentive listener. And so in many ways, when we think about Kwame Ture and the move towards Black power, it's not a move that is made lightly. It's a move that is made after understanding that the institutions in the United States are anti-Black, and Black power would produce the kind of political self-determination that Black people required so that they could offer up strategies to diagnose the illness of systemic racism and white supremacy and come up with solutions for themselves. In a lot of ways, when we see Kwame Ture marching arm in arm with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1966 in the Meredith March, and those two continue to have a close relationship until Dr. King's assassination, we're seeing two mobilizers and organizers really influence each other. And in certain ways, Dr. King's refusal to blanketly criticize Black power has to do with his respect for the activism of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Kwame Ture's love for Dr. King. He says he loves Dr. King. You know, Kwame Ture is the person that Dr. King calls up when King says he's going to come out against the Vietnam War at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the boldest way he does. This is after the April 4th, 1967 Riverside address. Dr. King comes out against the war at Ebenezer, and when you see the footage, it's Kwame Ture who's leading the standing ovation. And so this is a good time to talk about Kwame Ture's his anti-imperialism, his anti-capitalism, his anti-racism, and his move towards revolutionary Pan-Africanism. In a way, what happens to Kwame Ture as the 1960s speed up, history speeds up as well. If Kwame Ture had not left the United States for Conakry for good in 1969, really, I don't think he would have made it and survived the end of the decade. There were so many different political assassinations. The thing we know now, and we still don't know all of it, but the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, the New York Police Department's Bureau of Special Services Investigation Unit. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of illegal state-sanctioned surveillance, political assassinations, illegal arrests, trumped-up charges, harassment, and murder of Black political radicals in the 1960s and the 1970s. And we know this, we have this documented. And so when we think about Kwame Ture certainly would not have lasted and made it out of the 1960s if he hadn't gone to Africa. And part of going to Africa is really the 1967 5-month tour of the world that he takes, where he goes to Vietnam, he goes to Conakry, he goes to so many different parts of the world, speaking in favor of Black power. He's the one who gives Angela Davis so many networks and introductions when he meets with Angela Davis, the very famous iconic activist, in 1967 in London at a radical conference. It's Kwame Ture who really helps publicize the Black Panther Party for self-defense by agreeing first to become their first field marshal in 1967 at the invitation of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, and later their honorary prime minister in 1968. And it's really Kwame Ture's presence at Free Huey Newton rallies on February 17th and February 18th, 1968, that provide the Black Panther Party with the ballast to become this very, very important, iconic, revolutionary, anti-imperialist group of the late 1960s. It's important for us to understand that when we look at Kwame Ture and his evolution from the 1967 book co-written with Charles Hamilton, Black Power, to 1970-71, Stokely Speaks, from Black Power back to Pan-Africanism. His time in Africa and his connection with Ghanaian President Sekou Toure and the former Prime Minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, is really key here. Under the tutelage of both Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Toure, Stokely Carmichael is going to change his name to Kwame Ture. Kwame in honor of Kwame Nkrumah. And of course, Kwame Nkrumah is the political figure who shepherds the former Gold Coast as a former British colony into Ghana, and this idea of African self-determination, the Organization of African Unity conferences that Malcolm X went to by 1964, and really this idea of a United States of Africa that is thwarted in the context of neocolonialism and external interference from the West, and at times internecine battles and disagreements, coups, corruption internally within Africa. But it's important for us to remember that Kwame Ture, the legacy of Kwame Ture, is connected to some of the most important Pan-African revolutionaries of the post-war era, especially Kwame Nkrumah, and the creation of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, which becomes Kwame Ture's main political vehicle the last 30 years of his life, is really connected to the teachings of Kwame Nkrumah and the mentoring and the relationship that Kwame Ture has with Nkrumah before Nkrumah's passing. And then, of course, the relationship he has with Sekou Toure before Sekou Toure's passing as well. Finally, and I want to close, and then we can get into a discussion and a back and forth. When we think about Kwame Ture, especially during the last 30 years of his life, even as the American mainstream media no longer covered Kwame Ture's exploits, globally, he was very much an important political figure. He still visited the United States every year on speaking tours, but he also visited multiple parts of Africa, the Third World, Europe, and other parts of the world, and maintained ties, diplomatic ties with important leaders, was a counselor to many important leaders in Africa and the Third World and the United States, and continued to be a politically active organizer on behalf of the idea of radical and revolutionary Pan-Africanism and Black self-determination, even after that idea was no longer in vogue. So in a lot of ways, when we think about Kwame Ture, this would be a perfect time for him now, were he alive, because the Black Lives Matter ferment that has come out of the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, and then really reached a new crescendo after the murders of Breonna Taylor and the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So much of that ferment owes itself to Kwame Ture and the movement for Black power and radical Black self-determination and radical Pan-Africanism that really was Kwame Ture's calling card. So in a lot of ways, the demonstrations that we've seen, the civil disobedience, but also the rhetorical militancy. Kwame Ture, like Malcolm X, really did serve as both a prosecuting attorney and a prime minister of Black America during the 1960s. And then by the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, he really becomes the generational political conscience of Black folks the world over, who is reminding all of us that we should be ready for revolution, that we should be readers and thinkers and studying, but that only a revolution will end the systemic racism, oppression, violence, economic inequality, the marginalization and scapegoating of Africa and the Caribbean, as well as the super exploitation of Black people and their wealth, the expropriation of their wealth the world over. And that's really, really important. You know, in a lot of ways, Kwame Ture remains probably the most important figure from the 1960s and the civil rights Black Power era who is not well known globally. And certainly so many have tried to tarnish his legacy and tried to erase and efface his legacy from the history books and from the discourse that we talk about. So I think it's important for us to remember his legacy is one that is very, very vibrant. And really, Kwame Ture was just as a person, a special individual, somebody who was unbelievably compassionate, somebody who was erudite, but who was an organic intellectual who really connected with ordinary Black people, the politics of the Black quotidian the world over. He connected with ordinary folks who were farmers in Guinea. He connected with sharecroppers in Mississippi and Alabama. He connected with folks who were incarcerated in New York and Los Angeles. All those people loved and respected Kwame Ture. Even near the end of his life, he has a rapprochement with the then Congressman John Lewis, who he had replaced as SNCC chairman. And they had been friends, but certainly there was tension after Kwame Ture replaced John Lewis, because John Lewis, as we saw when President Barack Obama memorialized John Lewis, was a very important figure, very compassionate figure, but he becomes a very mainstream figure, right? So John Lewis becomes sort of this American saint by the time of his passing, whereas Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture, when he takes over as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the first thing he says is that SNCC will not participate in the White House Civil Rights Conference because it is a subterfuge for white supremacy. So they're not going to put you on a stamp after that. They're not going to give you standing ovations after that. There's not going to be a Kwame Ture holiday in the United States unless there was a complete revolutionary overhaul, because Kwame Ture was really unafraid to speak truth to power. And he's really the most unapologetic Black revolutionary of his time, one who connects the struggle for Black political self-determination to the freedom and the liberation of Africa. And really at the start of this, Dr. Cambone talked about Juneteenth and talked about African Liberation Day. You know, Kwame Ture, the whole movement to end apartheid in South Africa, African Liberation Day, Randall Robinson and Trans-Africa, anti-apartheid movements. Kwame Ture is somebody who is inspiring Stephen Bantu Biko. Kwame Ture is somebody who inspires revolutionary Pan-Africanists who are in prison, who are being marginalized, who are being murdered across the world, and not just in the 1960s, but up until today. So it's important for us to understand just how big and vibrant his legacy was, because Kwame Ture refuses to cower in the face of what Malcolm X called world white supremacy in the post-war period. And when we think about his vision of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, some of which he outlines in speeches and the books that he wrote, it's really a vision of an Africa that is flourishing, that's compassionate, but that is also connected to the notion of Black dignity globally. And like Malcolm X, who defined Black dignity as something that was God-given, that we all possessed, and citizenship was just the external recognition of that dignity, Kwame Ture knew that the only way you were going to have Black dignity recognized in the United States and in the Caribbean was by having Africa as a political power and a jewel because we were all African people. So he understood that we had to mine that history. We had to respect that history. We had to form deep coalitions. In his case, Kwame Ture goes and lives in Guinea for the rest of his life and becomes a Guinean citizen and becomes really an African. But he always reminded all of us, and even when I heard him speak in Philadelphia now, almost 30 years ago, Kwame Ture was reminding us that we were all African people, and he meant it, and that there was great honor and dignity, but also a purpose in being African, and that the minute we forgot that, we became isolated in the struggle. We started to define ourselves and see ourselves through the eyes of the oppressor. Yet if we connected with Africa, if we connected with our history and our roots, we saw how powerful and how dignified we were, and it really ennobled all of us, right? So it's really Kwame Ture whose life and words teach that lesson. And I'll close by saying, when we think about his Pan-Africanism, again, he's somebody who is organizing in New York City. He's organizing in the Mississippi Delta. He's organizing in Alabama, Howard University, Washington, D.C. But he's also traveling up the Sierra Maestra with Fidel Castro in the summer of 1967. He's also having lunch with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam in 1967. He can speak before thousands of people, and he innovates the chant, "Hell no, we won't go." Kwame Ture is the person who innovates the anti-war movement of the late 1960s and popularizes that movement. Kwame Ture and SNCC come out against the Vietnam War before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? And so we think about Kwame Ture as somebody who is this iconic leader, but a lot of times we're not looking in a granular way at the way in which he lived his life. He's the one who gives Malcolm X credit, El Haj Malik El Shabazz, as well, and says that Malcolm understood that we were an African people, and I want to follow Malcolm to Africa. And he's speaking about Malcolm's 3 tours of Africa, the first in 1959 and 2 more in 1964. So Kwame Ture's Pan-African, revolutionary Pan-African legacy really continues to reverberate in a global age of Black Lives Matter. We would not have this global age of Black Lives Matter without Kwame Ture, especially because Kwame Ture continued to believe that we needed revolutionary Black political self-determination, even in the age of neoliberalism, in the age of Reagan, in the age of Thatcher, in the age of supply side economics, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the continued super exploitation of Haiti, African resources, folks in the Caribbean, and folks in the United States. So he was a Black revolutionary decades after the idea of revolution was no longer in vogue. And now we're living in an age where we can crystal clear, I think this is an age of reconstruction, a third reconstruction in the United States and globally, but we can see the forces of reaction, the forces of redemption versus the forces of reconstruction in a very clear way. And we can also see that there are these movements around the world to resist, where folks are putting their bodies on the line. And 18 to 25 million people came out in the streets in the United States in 2020. And that certainly would not have happened without the legacy of Kwame Ture. Thank you.
Well, 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 well. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Joseph, Peniel Joseph. I think it has been a very, very rich presentation. And, I am so pleased that you gave us that kind of in-depth, wide, and yet deep understanding of our brother Kwame, because at home here, we are struggling with, let's say, entities in authority, figures, and so on, who seem not to understand why we are constantly saying this brother has to be recognized and given the recognition in his own homeland that maybe he's not received elsewhere. So we're really grateful for that. And I'm sure all our brothers and sisters who are listening in, I just glanced a little bit at some of the where people were listening from just now, and I saw that we had connections out of London and so on. You know, you say the word Kwame and people want to know more. So this is, it's really been a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. And of course, we're going to open the floor for questions. So please, colleagues and friends, get out your phone and make good use of it now. You have this brother at your fingertips. Imagine that. So ask the questions that you want answered about the legacy of Kwame Ture, about Pan-Africanism, about this struggle against imperialism and so on that has been conducted over all these many years.
And one thing, Dr. Cambone, I would say is that, you know, in places like the Caribbean and in certain places in Africa, certain places in the United States, Kwame Ture was unwelcome because people felt he was going to be an agitator, including by former friends, because Kwame Ture was very honest. I mean, he did not like to publicly criticize Black people and believed in Black solidarity, but he would be honest about what happened, for instance, in the United States, to Black elected officials and the way in which they became, you know, pro-Black capitalism, pro-neoliberalism, in ways that continued to segregate and impoverish Black communities they had once vowed to defend to the death. So he talked about these contradictions and these hypocrisies and these juxtapositions. And again, as I was saying in the talk, one of the things that we can say about Kwame Ture is that he never gave up on this idea of revolution. He was, you know, an African revolutionary. He believed in an African socialist revolution. He believed in you know, a beloved community where there was going to be no racism and no economic inequality. And so in many ways, those things became even more threatening the older he got. And that's why I said, like, it would be, you know, Kwame Ture, you know, would have only been 82 just this month. You know, June 29th is his birthday, 1941. And when we think about Kwame Ture, this would have been a perfect age and time for him because so much of what we saw with, you know, George Floyd and Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Corinne Gaines, this is what he had talked about in the context of the 1960s and the 70s and 80s. And he had always predicted that the kind of groundswell uprising we saw in 2020, what people call the racial and political reckoning, was going to happen in the United States and around the world. And we're seeing it. So in a lot of ways, this would have been a perfect time for him. You know, we just lost him all too soon.
All too soon, all too soon. Just to say that, you know, the Emancipation Support Committee, we worked hard to try to have that ban lifted from Kwame Ture so that he could re-enter Trinidad and Tobago. We were successful, and we were also successful in getting the powers that be at the time to provide some kind of support, resources to him in those last years when he was battling his prostate cancer. And that was done. But we are still struggling to ensure that the street on which he was born, which is now called Oxford Street, to have that street name removed and his name, Kwame Ture, put on that street. And we're struggling with that battle, and we're not giving up. You know, we're going down fighting until it happens.
Well, no, it will happen. And Dr. Cambone, so often prophets are not recognized in their own country, right? And so, yes, again, Kwame Ture is not somebody who you can just absorb and co-opt in ways that have happened to other historical figures. It's so raw and so unapologetic. You know, one thing I'll say, an anecdote about Kwame Ture, when he's being interviewed on Eyes on the Prize, and he's saying what he experienced in the Mississippi Delta, one thing that struck me when I was young is that he talked about experiencing raw terror in the Mississippi Delta as a young man. And he was one of the most eloquent and honest and courageous figures because, you know, when you talk to Congressman John Lewis, who I love, this is nothing
Yes.
against John Lewis, they wouldn't speak with the same candor, right? It was sort of, we shall overcome. Kwame Ture said, look, this is what we saw, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
if you stole, Kwame Ture said, you're a thief.
Yes.
Right? And so the idea, so much of American and world history is connected to crimes against Black humanity, and Kwame Ture called out those crimes, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The society that then punishes you for calling out those crimes, that's the sick society, right? And we live in a sick society globally. It's not just the infection of white supremacy and imperialism and racism and sexism and all the different things that marginalize people. They don't just hit Europe and America and somehow Haiti's excluded and Trinidad's excluded because we Black and we so special. Dr. Campbell, we're implicated too, right? It affects all of us, even as we didn't start it, right? We didn't start this thing, right? But we're affected by it. And what Kwame Ture did was, again, he says, look, here's what we experienced. He wasn't giving you this we shall overcome story. And Kwame Ture was in the Mississippi Delta, June 21st, 1964, when Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman are murdered by white police and white vigilantes and white law enforcement. When they're murdered and assassinated, Kwame Ture and Charlie Cobb and others go looking for them, right? So they experienced it. They did stuff that we'll never do, right? So they were braver than us. They're more courageous than us, right? So they did all of that. And so, of course, 50, 60 years later, that society doesn't want anything to do with Kwame Ture. I think the sadness is that a place like Trinidad in the Caribbean doesn't have Kwame Ture. Somebody like, when we think about our sister Rihanna, who does such great things for the Caribbean, one of the things could be, hey, resuscitating Kwame Ture, because these are our heroes. These are the people who believed and loved us when these countries wouldn't love us back, and these countries still don't love us, right? They still don't love us. So Kwame Ture had that love for all of us and for Africa and the Caribbean and for Black folks poor and struggling and toiling. And of course, that means that his memory becomes under fire and marginalized and undernourished
Absolutely. One of the things you said is that he was always a Pan-Africanist. And I thought that was very interesting because, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are very proud of the early Pan-Africanists, George Padmore, Henry Sylvester Williams. And it's again, those early Pan-Africanists are not given the kind of honor and dignity and remembrance that they ought to be, because they are the forerunners to a lot of the movement for Pan-Africanism. And that is also something we are working assiduously. And that's why, for us, the highest award that you can receive is the Henry Sylvester Williams Award of Excellence. And had you come here, brother, we would have been glad to put one of those in your hands as a young scholar, doing all this hard work. But we're it's not too late. We're going to get you here in Trinidad and Tobago.
Absolutely. And Dr. Campbell, when you have those built environments where you praise Henry Sylvester Williams and Dr. Padmore and Queen Mother Moore, Audley Moore, and the Black women and men throughout Africa and the Caribbean and the United States who've been Pan-Africanists, what that does, it's going to change your policies. It changes your legislation. It changes your schooling. It changes how you view religion and culture. It changes how you view the environment and voting and housing. It's going to change how you view medical care and mental health care. It's going to change wellness. It's going to change how you do business and whether or not you're going to give loans to Black women and African women and Trinidadian women and have them head small businesses and head big international conglomerates and companies. So that's why people don't want to do it. If you recognize, it means you've got to also, there has to be some impact to the recognition, right?
That's right.
So if the built landscape was filled with artifacts of revolutionary Pan-Africans, it means
Yeah.
our whole society and culture from Trinidad to the United States to Africa is going to be
Mhm.
transformed.
Yeah, that's a big battle we're having in the Caribbean right now, looking at decolonizing our spaces,
Mhm.
our physical spaces. It's a big battle because we are also in the battle for reparations. And our young activists are saying to our powers that be, when you're talking about reparations, you've got to turn around and you've got to decolonize your spaces. You have the power to do that. You may not have the power to extract the reparations that are required and must be extracted, but you have the power to decolonize our spaces. So do that so that our children and the next generation can feel the pride of their history and see it and be able to respect it and regard it. Okay, so Doc, before you and I just keep talking, I've got to pay attention to these questions that are pouring in on me here. Otherwise, I don't know what people are going to rise up against me, boy. Oh gosh. Someone is saying that your work is very unique, and your presentation they're giving high praises to it, and they're even asking, well, where exactly are you based? Maybe I didn't make that clear enough. So they're very expressing strong gratitude for your presentation.
Thank you. University of Texas at Austin, but I'm a native New Yorker. So that's another Kwame Ture became a New York transplant, but we're both sons of the Caribbean, me, Haiti, Kwame Ture, Trinidad, both raised by strong Black women, my mother and May Charles. And, both, New York indelibly, shaped our lives. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
As you said, Ray Charles, my husband always has a joke that he gives about when Kwame came home. They met him at the airport, and they took him down to his aunt's home. And they waited a few moments, and there was the greeting and what have you, and they were taking him out, of course, to eat and to meet other revolutionary brothers and sisters who were anxious to meet Kwame. This is before he spoke, and so on. And as they were about to take him out, his very elderly aunt looked at them and said, "But where are you taking the child? Where are you going with him?" She was for her, he was still the child that left her at age 11. So she says, "Well, where are you going with the child? He's probably needs his rest," and so on. And that was quite.
This has to be 1990 when he returned to Trinidad.
He came to Trinidad in about. Let me see if I can get my dates. I'm all of a sudden gone bananas with my dates. Let me see if I can turn that.
Is it 1990? 1990 when he returns?
He did come to Trinidad in the early period, but that was sort of under the radar.
Surreptitious. Yeah, I saw that. He comes in the 1970s, which
He came formally in 1996 to speak. We had him speak at the Central Bank Auditorium, which is where we're going to have you speak when you get here.
Yeah.
And that was 1996. And that was the big occasion when we got him to return, and we got the government to lift the ban, and we managed to get the government to agree on some resources to support him as he battled with his prostate cancer.
Okay.
So that was, but he did slip into the country a couple of times under the radar. Now I have a question for you, brother. Let me see how we make of this one. The Caribbean was a hotbed of Black power during the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, from St. Croix to Belize in Central America, and almost every island in between, with Trinidad and Tobago being at the epicenter. Has your journey in the study of Black power allowed you to examine Black power in the Caribbean? And if so, what substantive differences and similarities have you been able to identify or consider?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm a big reader of great scholarship on Black power in the Caribbean, and there's Black power in every place from Guyana and Bermuda to Trinidad, and even Haiti. Duvalier said he was doing Black power, right? So I think the things that we see there are going to be real movements, Jamaica for self-determination, But at the end of the day, very similarly to what happens with Black power in the United States, at least by the level of Black political power and elected officials, is that they become very much caught up within a paradigm of power and sort of the constraints of neoliberalism. And by neoliberalism, I mean, even during the Black Power period, what global capitalism is becoming is super exploitative in the sense of the privatization of public space, the appropriation of resources that were meant for the public that go into private hands. So anti-redistributive justice. So it's redistributive injustice that occurs even when Black folks become head of states, and sometimes especially when Black folks become heads of state. So what you don't get, both when you think about Black mayors in the Congressional Black Caucus, but also Black prime ministers in the Caribbean, is what some people had expected. They had expected that if Black faces went to higher places, there was going to be more justice. There was going to be a better police department. You were going to get better sanitation and social services. You're going to have better schools. You're going to have a better opportunity, more housing. You were going to build more wealth. That happened in a way for a small group of people, right? Both in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Africa, whether we're talking about South Africa or whatever, right? But for the bulk of the Black population, instead of heading towards a kind of post-colonial future, it really became a neo-colonial future. And again, as we in certain places, as we see what happened with the late great Walter Rodney in Guyana, Forbes Burnham's Guyana, Walter Rodney is assassinated by the state, but the state, it's not Richard Nixon. It's and that's in ways that happened to Patrice Lumumba, and what happened, to Lumumba and Mobutu and what the Congo, which for a time becomes Zaire, and you have Lumumba's assassin hosting Muhammad Ali by 1974, having looted the treasury of billions, right? And so it's a complex story, but in a lot of ways it's sad where ordinary Black people sort of end up with the short end of the stick, no matter what democratic or authoritarian or socialist or conservative or whatever form of government you want to label it, in many ways. And again, there's exceptions. I think about Amilcar Cabral and Guinea-Bissau before his assassination.
Oh yes.
There even what happened in before the assassination of the brother in Burkina Faso in 1987. So there are or Maurice Bishop in the New Jewel movement. There are exceptions. There are people, Grenada. There are people who try, but that's where, again, Kwame Ture was under surveillance and an object of counterintelligence programs by the FBI, by the CIA, by the State Department, by different organizations. So it's very, very difficult and tough. And I think what the world is more accepting of is what you've seen in South Africa. It's more accepting of, in the aftermath of Mandela and Mandela's refusal to nationalize things in South Africa, industries, what you have is a run-of-the-mill sort of kleptocracy in South Africa. But everybody's fine with that because the money has stayed tight and white in South Africa, even as Black folks who looted enough to become millionaire and billionaires, right? But for the most part, and I was in South Africa years ago and spent a month there, and when you had the groundings with the sisters and brothers, things were very, very bad there because there was so much corruption there. But in certain ways, Mandela gets the Nobel Prize because he doesn't nationalize stuff. He doesn't say, hey, I'm going to take this so that there's going to be a safety net and a floor. Certainly, you would think in a country that rich with a Black majority that there should have been no more Bantu stands and no more segregation, no more poverty, but that didn't happen.
Equality, but that didn't happen. But it's interesting that in the Caribbean, the Black Power movement did, in fact, uh, push the governments of the day to do the things that we say need to be done. In a sense, they did nationalize. They grabbed back the resources that had been in the hands of the colonials, and they tried to deconstruct that colonialism and from at an economic level, because that was one of the strong issues that the Black Power movement raised, which was, I mean, we said it for everybody to understand, we don't want the crumbs, we want the whole bread. So they had to, the resources that were we called it I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but it was that those resources that were critical as catalysts to economic development, those resources should be in the hands of the people. And so governments did nationalize right across the board many of those things. In the neoliberal period, that's when all of those things started to sell right, left, and center.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And so the accumulation of corporate power and sort of global money really constrained people's ability to trade and really the fall of the Soviet Union, what's happened with China. I mean, things changed dramatically to sort of be able to do, the fall of Cuba, for people to be able to try to have that non-aligned movement and to try to get along without necessarily doing business or being exploited by the usual suspects.
Now, it's interesting that you also mentioned the whole program and so on. And there has been some theorizing by some folks that actually Dr. Walter Rodney, our good soul, Brother Walter, that his assassination was not just the work of the state, but it really was guided by those external forces as well. So that's a very interesting area of research. And we've heard some of that by some brothers who had produced a very good film on Walter's life. And that was some of the discussion they had there. But let me take us back to some of the questions before people take my head as well. Okay, so one of the questions that is on people's minds is about, and let me just locate that question. Yes. Okay, so here we go. It says, I suppose you must be asked often by activists from the women's movement how the core group of Black men whom you have written about so far stand up to scrutiny in today's elaboration of gender issues. What would you say? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I write about this in my book on Stokely, and in my latest book, really, actually, Third Reconstruction focuses on Black women through these 3 periods of Reconstruction. So you can check that out as well. But no, I mean, I think that there are aspects of what Kwame Ture is doing that doesn't give enough attention to gender, that doesn't give enough attention to the sexual oppression and exploitation of women globally, right? So in that sense, it's not what we would today call an intersectional analysis. I think that Kwame Ture has been, because he told a joke at Waveland about the position of women in the movement, has been excoriated by especially white feminists for decades and decades, but I don't feel that that was his perspective on women at all, right? And so I think that when the women who I interviewed about Kwame Ture always said that he was very respectful. He's somebody who elevated women, somebody who supported women in positions of leadership, et cetera. Now, I don't necessarily think that he had a feminist analysis when he was writing and thinking intellectually. I think over time he may have become more open to that. So I think that, and again, I think the standards of today, it really depends on where you're at and what movements you're in for those standards, because it's very fluid, right? It's very fluid. You could have the movement for Black Lives Matter is very, very expansive in a sense of saying, everyone counts within the Black community, including queer people and trans folks and that. But there's other parts of the Black community globally that don't accept that, that don't accept that. So it really just depends on where you're at. There are parts of are definitions of Black liberation that are very expansive, parts that are still patriarchal, and people are fine with that, even women and men being fine with that, right? So it's complex there, depends on where you're at. But I think that Kwame Ture, who was constantly learning and constantly a student, would have been open to certain aspects of revolutionary analysis that really centered Black women and their role and their histories.
Right. I see we've got a couple of questions which I should bring to your attention. Okay, so one brother is saying, what contribution did Walter Rodney and Du Bois play in the Black Power movement?
Mm-hmm.
And what was Forbes Burnham's role in the Grenada Revolution? And that those are very kinds of specific questions, but if you'd like to share any thoughts on that. There's another question. What accounts for the significant under-promotion of the scientific fact that all mankind derived from a Black man or woman? And that is also something that is being talked a lot about now. You've got another question, which maybe we could. Do you believe, Dr. Joseph, that part of the resistance to African socialism in Africa and within the Pan-African movement generally is as espoused by the legendary Brother Ture and others is as a result of a bitter taste of the Lenin Marxist historical birthing? Or
well, I would say that certainly there was anti-communism and fear of communism within Africa, but I would also say that a lot of we have to say it's a multiplicity of factors. So there's external influence coming from the West, and sort of disruption and disruptive movements, right? But part of what's happened in Africa, because Africa has its own very specific history, and then nation states within Africa have very specific histories, is that a lot of times when you have somebody like Kwame Nkrumah or Sekou Touré, and they sort of have a full-blown sort of political vision and perspective, they had at times real challenges implementing those visions and having the resources to implement those visions. So one thing, Dr. Kambon, after a while, people want their trash picked up if they live in cities. They want electricity to work, right? And so in a lot of ways, when you to build a society, you need the plumbing and the bathrooms. I'm living in the United States, and Jackson, Mississippi, which has a Black mayor and Black folks, has been abandoned by the governor of Mississippi, where there's brown water, the infrastructure abandoned because it's Black folks, and it's completely racist, right? So, I think that, African socialism, if you were able to have the resources and the political good governance to make it work, in specific nation states probably could still work, or kind of social democratic Africa, right? But at the same time, you still, you need a history where there are free and fair elections. Look, the United States isn't any better. You can see that the United States is under tremendous pressures, and you can see the democratic vulnerabilities to the institutions with the big lie, with the January 6th riot. So Africa has its own challenges and pressures and vulnerabilities, right? And so I would say that that's where that comes into play. And then, Walter Rodney, I think Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is really important. That came out in 1968. And, Walter Rodney, for a time being and living in Dar es Salaam, is very, very important. And he impacts Black power activists, who, especially those who are moving towards the left and having a class analysis, an analysis of class and imperialism, right? And some of that turns people into sort of African-centered socialist. Some of that turns people into more European-centered Marxist-Leninist, and they don't want to talk about race anymore. Some of that turns people into Maoists. So there's a lot there. And W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, contributes through the organizing of the Pan-African conferences and through the Souls of Black Folks, and his really, you know, Du Bois is a genius, and his just huge institution building and his huge intellectual and political capaciousness. And Du Bois, you know, you think about Ross Monkanen, and you think about so many different Black Power, Sylvester Turner, so many different Black Power, Kwame Nkrumah, so many different Black Power figures and Pan-African figures and anti-colonial figures. Henry Sylvester Williams, Du Bois gives a lot of them networks and anchors, and Du Bois is convinced that they're the ones who are going to liberate Africa for themselves, right? Which is really saying a lot, because you think about Marcus Garvey, as brilliant as Garvey is, he's still of the mindset that it's going to be folks who have received the kind of Western education he did in Jamaica and others who are then going to assist. And he's not coming in with the humility to be like, well, we've got a lot to learn from Africa and Africans. You know what I mean? Like that, right? And a lot of times people, you know, who can't see that bigger vision don't have that humility. So, and then, you know, so yeah, so that's what I would say about all of that.
Okay, Doc, I know we've kept you quite some time, and we could keep you much longer. I mean, the questions are rolling in, but we're going to give you a break, and because we understand your time limits and constraints, we want to thank you very, very much. It's been a really rich and interesting evening, and we really thank you for your time and for your energy and for your
Thank you.
work.
Thank
You
you.
know, we appreciate that deeply, and we're sure that the information you shared with us this evening is going to go a long way to help all of those who may have been sitting somewhat on the fence, worried about Kwame, and maybe we're making too much of him. We are sure that the kind of information you shared today will help convince people that there's much more that should be made of Kwame than what we have been making of him.
And I would say to definitely read Kwame's autobiography, Ready for Revolution, with Michael Thelwell, and to read Stokely Speaks, Black Power Back to Pan-Africanism, to read the expanded 1992 edition of Black Power with a new afterword by Kwame and Charles Hamilton. You know, my biography, Stokely Alive. But I think reading and finding out about Kwame Ture is really, really important. Certainly go on YouTube and look at videos, and you'll see his discussions, you'll see his speeches, and you'll just see his travels. You know, Kwame Ture traveled to, Brixton, England, and travels to Black neighborhoods all across the world, travels to Paris and China and Africa, throughout. And he's in Egypt, he's in Cairo, he's in the Middle East and Palestine. So you have to understand that he's in Cuba with, in a truck being driven, a Jeep, by Fidel Castro himself. And they're in the Sierra Maestra for 3 days in Cuba. So this is an extraordinary figure who, again, lives multiple lifetimes. We should see, movies and miniseries about his life. And the reason why he's been largely erased and effaced is because he really had this unapologetic love for Black people globally, believed in Black political self-determination, believed in radical Black power, which goes beyond Black capitalism, and really loved Black people with a huge personal sincerity. Kwame Ture is somebody who, the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Black women all loved Kwame Ture because he was so respectful. He took care of their kids. He slept on the floor of shotgun shacks in the Mississippi Delta. He did all the courageous and heroic stuff you're never going to do. Okay. Just never going to do it, because what you can be is as compassionate, you can be as empathetic, you can be as eager of a student, but no one's going to put your life on the line in the same exact way he did countless times, right? And no one's telling you to spend, or your children or your grandchildren, your 20th birthday in Parchman Penitentiary, the worst prison farm in Mississippi. Nobody's, but he did all of that for us. And I think the least we can do is learn about his story and honor him and see how his story and his activism continues to influence us and reverberate towards today. And we would not be in this global age of Black Lives Matter if not for Kwame Ture. Definitely, if not for Kwame. His legacy is that big.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Joseph. Thank you very much. I am sure that that message is going to, reverberate around the Caribbean. We thank you very, very much. And colleagues, I'm going to allow Dr. Joseph to depart while we look a little bit, remind you about what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Do not forget to tune in on June 29th when we talk about Africa on the international stage, the challenges and successes. We have Professor James Small. James is not stranger to Trinidad and Tobago. Professor Small has spoken a couple of times at the Kwame Ture Lecture Series, but what makes him a very current and interesting person is that he, of course, has not just talked about Africa and talked about the suffering of people, but he's been an activist. He himself has gone to Ghana and engaged with our brothers and sisters in Ghana and worked there for some time. We have Mr. Joseph Aketema with us on that evening from the University of Ghana, and a young woman, I understand, from the African Union Commission. She's head of the CEDAW, and she will speak to us about Africa, its challenges and successes. Then on the 6th of July, remember, we'll be looking at Haiti, a Pan-African responsibility. There we'll have Professor Muriel Fanon Mendez France. As you know, she's the daughter of France Fanon, a very brilliant speaker. And we're going to give her as much time as she needs to be able to help us understand what that Pan-African responsibility looks like, together with Royal Gibbons, who was the founder of the Creative Arts Center of UWI and founder and director of the Caribbean Yard campus. And Royal is going to look at the way in which we use theater and creative arts to establish an educational processes around Haiti and help get a sense of what our responsibility looks like. Then on the 13th of July, we look at youth in crisis, the responsibility of educators and elders. And on that occasion, we have none other than Dr. Pedro Noguera, a brilliant sociologist who's done all of the research and work on young African men, young Black men, wherever they are, and the challenges they face and how they have been coping and how we can help them cope better with the in the current situation that they face. Along with that panel will be our own young Khadija Dyer, talking about the processes and the programs that the Emancipation Support Committee runs for young people, and Shabaka Kambon will be our moderator for that program. On the 20th, that's the last of the 4 series, we have Women in the Pan-African Struggle. Dr. Carol Boyce Davies will lead off on that. She'll be talking about none other than our own Pan-Africanist, Claudia Jones. She will be supported by Dr. Olabisi Kuboni, who will be looking at women in the struggle here in Trinidad and Tobago, and Dr. Keisha Thompson, a young woman who has just completed a video on women in the struggle here in Trinidad and Tobago. That will be a very interesting discussion. So we look forward to you joining us again for these very, very interesting and exciting sessions that we have coming up for this 2023 Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And so I'm going to just take a few minutes for us to deeply thank once again Dr. Peniel Joseph for taking the time out of his really cramped schedule. He's everywhere in demand. Just go on YouTube, put his name in, and you'll see that he's been speaking on the issue of the June 19th. He's been speaking on the issue of this recently uncovered error that had been, and that's one of the things I did want to talk to him about, but so much other things came up. You know that there had been this statement that had been published in a Playboy magazine based on an interview that was held by Martin Luther King many years ago. And that particular statement suggested that, and was the source of all the future information that said Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were at loggerheads, because Martin Luther King sort of in that so-called statement said that Malcolm was kind of like hot-headed and only speaking about and sort of dismissed him for only speaking about the negative things that happens to African people when he had never said that. That has come to light now, that was an error. It was a bit of what shall I say, writing by the author, and not there was no truth in that statement whatsoever. And that discussion about, and I urge you, those of you who can get your hands on The Sword and the Shield, that's the discussion about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, a very interesting discussion by our brother Peniel Joseph on a deeper understanding and appreciation of these two giants at a time in the movement, the Black Power movement, and the struggle for social justice and racial justice in North America and globally. And of course, here's his book once again, Stokely A Life. Try to get your hands on a copy. It's a wonderful book to read. I mean, you could open any page and start reading this book. It's so fascinatingly well written. And it's wonderful to read. And of course, there's Kwame Ture's own book, which is just behind me here. You'll see it, Ready for the Revolution. That's how Kwame answered his phone. That's how he greeted you when you said, "How are you doing, brother?" "I'm ready for the revolution." And we certainly do have a revolution ahead of us to transform ourselves, to transform our environments, to achieve greater equality, social justice, racial justice, and give us a different sense of our life. With that, I think we're going to say good evening, and I'm going to ask turn you back over to our host, who will play our closing clip for you. Thank you very much. Good night to all, and thank you all for joining us for the last hour and 45 minutes.